The illustrious Jabba bids you welcome. I'm going to regret this.
I'm Pete Mitchell. He's Peyton Jones. And this is the Church Planter Podcast, brought to you by Church Planter Magazine.
Hey, Church Planter, this is Pete Mitchell.
And this is Peyton Jones.
And unfortunately, you turned into the Church Planter Podcast, so you're stuck with us now.
One day, me talk pretty.
I just saw Conan the other day. That's totally what that reminds me of.
Oh, gosh.
Just a little Conan there.
Well, hey, guys, welcome to the show. This is a very cool show. As you know, recently we've been inviting guests onto the show, and they haven't just been any guests. They've actually been the guests that Pete didn't know this when we started doing this. We had a chat, and I said, hey, we should invite people on. And he said, yeah, I think that sounds good. And then, I don't remember. I'm just taking credit for it. I don't know if that's actually how it happened, but
I think he just told me we're inviting people on. Oh, okay.
And you know, nobody actually wanted to come on the show, so I had to grab people I knew.
It's usually people who don't know the show that come on it, right? Because they're like, oh, okay, sure, I'll be on a podcast. And then they listen to it. Like, I'm kind of worried about, I got Lonnie lined up, and I'm like, he's like, I want to listen to your podcast. I'm like,
No.
Let me warn you first.
I'll send you an episode. Send them a respectable episode. But as you know, welcome to the podcast. This is a Church Planter Podcast. We spend the first 30 minutes wasting your time and ours, but we figure you're church planting. Your life's hard enough. You need to laugh every once in a while. And if church planting teaches you anything, it's how human you are. And so we are going to kick straight in to introducing my guests, because what we have been doing over the last few weeks now is, as we've had guests, they haven't just been any guests, they've been my mentors. And this has been almost kind of like a mini series of what I learned from my mentor. And so my mentor today, I told Pete there's only two people. I remember Pete saying, I can pee next to any man, right? Like, nobody at a urinal next to Pete makes him nervous, right? It could be the President of the United States.
Anymore. We should throw that in there. Anymore.
But you know, there's two people that I can remember getting nervous around. Now, the first one was Francis Chan when he came on the podcast, and Pete chided me afterwards and said, hey, you know, you got nervous on, and he laughed at me and poked fun, which is kind of our friendship. But then the second time, I wasn't even on the podcast. I met Carrie Newhoff, and it totally floored me because Carrie's as down to earth as they come. And I met him at a coffee stand at Exponential, thinking, I you know, it was just, oh, hey, Carrie. And I think it was because he's so tall. I don't think it had anything to do with who he was. I think it was just, he was freakishly tall. Carrie, if you're listening, which I know you don't to this podcast, I did tell him the last time I interviewed him, though, because we interviewed him like 3 or 4 times. I interviewed him last time, Pete. You weren't there. You weren't there to stop me. And I told him, yeah, we didn't know who you were before you got big. And so we'd be like, hey, let's get that red-haired guy again. But anyways, this is the longest introduction ever. You can tell I'm putting it off because my guest today is one of my mentors, I would say, and it's hard to rank your mentors, but sometimes timing is everything. And at the time where I needed a mentor, a father figure. Paul was very much a father figure to Timothy, and this is my Paul. My mentor today is Dan Berg. He was my youth pastor. He was, if you ever heard me mention my mentor who was bivocational as a minister, he was a furniture repairman, taught me most of what I know, taught me mission, taught me my love for Lloyd Jones, for Spurgeon, taught me, I mean, if you've read Reaching the Unreached, you've basically, and Dan hasn't because I haven't sent him a copy yet. That's a bit of a sore point, but so much of Dan's fingerprints are all over me. God used this man to shape me. He used his wife, Doris, who is part of what we're going to talk about today. She was like a mother in Israel to many lost, broken kids. I mean, you could go on to multiple high schools in our city and surrounding cities. You could point at the most broken kids on those campuses and guaranteed, literally like the truck that had Alcoholica and all the spray paint all over it and wrapped around a lamppost, and the girl that had a heart attack in class and blanked out for 8 days. These people were in our youth group, and God was doing a powerful work. We were hiring punk bands, and they were coming to concerts and getting saves, and the cops had to come because the skinheads would come, and they'd knock all the amps over and do stage dives and start beating people up outside. And these were some radical things. And Dan was this guy at the middle of everything, just going, I'm a spectator. But these kids were getting saved. And we're going to dig down a little bit into that. But we're going to also talk about his book today, Hard Faith. So I guess at this point I should shut up and actually say, Dan, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you, Peyton. It's a joy to be here.
Yes, awesome to have you.
Yes, it's neat to see what you got happening here. I
think some people think it's going to be a little bit more polished than it really is, and then they get on the Zoom call and they're like, "No, you guys really are just hanging out in your house doing a podcast."
I know, that's why I only have this part of my head showing. The rest of me is probably not presentable.
Now you see where I got it from, Pete. See, this is my mentor. Like 2 weeks ago, this is exactly how I looked. See, now you know. Kilroy was here.
Yes, very true.
So, man, it is honestly, it's an honor to have you on here. I mean, how do you trace, someone who really poured into you and shaped you, and so I'll stop gushing on you. Pete, you normally asks you a question, which for you, I know it's a bit of a doozy. Pete, go ahead.
So, Dan, one of the first things we always like to ask is, what is your story of how you came to faith?
Oh, boy. I came home from a soccer game. I was playing soccer at the time, and my dream was to be a professional soccer player. And I came home one day and had just a failed relationship. And so on the way home from a game, I picked up a gallon bottle of VO, and I was going to get drunk off my hiney. And so I came home and sat down on my sofa, put the bottle of VO down, and turned on the television, and there was Dance Fever on. Now, you guys are probably too young to remember that show.
Dance Fever. That was a great show. First time I ever saw breakdancing was on Dance Fever.
Well, I'm going to disappoint you at this point. I turned it on, and I saw these people dancing, and I saw the gallon bottle of wine that I was about ready to drink. And I said to myself, what a loser. And I just felt this overwhelming sense that my life was going nowhere. And here I am, young, getting ready to get drunk, watching Dance Fever, and that associated with a loser. And I looked up to the ceiling of my apartment in Huntington Beach, California, with all sincerity, like a little child, because I was a very arrogant man, and the Lord is still working on that. And I said, whoever you are up there, show me what I'm supposed to do. And it wasn't 5 seconds, and it wasn't 10 seconds. Right around 7 seconds, there was a knock at the door. I got up. We had these little blinds. I pulled the mini blinds back, and there was a girl standing there with a Bible in her hand. And I opened the door, and she said, is Jeff here? Which was my roommate at the time. And I said, no, he's not. And she said, would you like to go to church with me? And I said, sure. So we went down, and I heard Pastor Chuck Smith speak on a Sunday night. And she invited me back the next day to a concert. And the message came, and I received Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior. Looking back, I'm thankful that it wasn't a vacuum cleaner salesman that came to the door, because I would probably be selling vacuums. That's what was going to get me into heaven. I'm glad it wasn't a Mormon or a Jehovah's Witness, because I might be riding a bike or wearing a suit. But God hears sincere prayers. And that prayer must have made it right to the throne of God. And he saved my soul. And I praise his name for it.
Amen.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
Well, Dan, normally we would ask our guests, "Hey, how'd you get into church planning?" And for the purpose of this interview, I mean, shoot, man, I shared a little bit about how you and I connected. I remember my mom. I got saved at Calvary Costa Mesa and went to her Episcopal church and was trying to go there for a bit. And the priest took me aside and said, "Hey, you're actually what we would call a fanatic, and I think you need to tone it down." And I was leading my friends to Christ in school and having these kind of like supernatural experiences. And I remember once, I remember one night I gave my heart to the Lord again. I think that was a process that happened. People ask me when I was saved. I don't know, but I think it happened about 20 times between this month and this month, because I kept like repenting and, "God, I give you everything." And I remember this one week, and it was when I got baptized with the Holy Spirit. And I remember standing to cross the street, and I could see all these kids sitting on a wall. Dan, you know some of these kids. I could see them all sitting on the wall, and I thought, "Oh, here we go." I could see that look in their eyes. I was getting ready to cross the crosswalk. Like, I got to run this gamut. There were 2 walls. I had to get into this neighborhood, and they just looked like they were waiting for me, man, like vultures. And I thought, I don't know what's coming, but it ain't good. So I prayed. I'm like, "God, whatever happens here, I'm in your hands." And so I walk through, and now keep in mind, I'm like 15 years old, and there's, all these kids sitting on the wall, and some of them are pretty. And one of the boys goes, "Hey, you a virgin?" And everybody just starts laughing. And I was a virgin. So it was like, yeah, I got to answer this question. Not going to lie about it. No, man, I've been with a million women, and so I say, "Yeah, as a matter of fact, I am." And they all start laughing. But God just gave me this confidence, and I go, "Yeah, as a matter of fact, I am, but it's by choice." Boom, boom, boom. And I just start sharing my butt off and witnessing. And that day, like 6 of those kids came to faith. And that was the Foldies and Sarah Meyer. And, there was somebody else. I can't remember who the other kid was. But it was like, oh, okay, I guess this is kind of what happens. And so about that time, my mom goes, "Hey, there's a Calvary Chapel in Westminster, at the Chapman Heading Adult Education Center I teach at." Now, I wasn't very sanctified, so I said, "Mom, shut up. There isn't," right? Because I was saved, but God was still doing a lot of work, and wasn't talking very nice to my mom at that point. And she goes, "No, honey, there is. There's a Calvary. It's another No, Mom, there's only one Calvary Chapel." She goes, "Okay, fine." So a few more weeks later, she said, "Hey, I talked to them, and yes, they are a Calvary Chapel, and they said they'd love to have you, and there's a youth group there." So it was on a Wednesday night. I came along. It was the Christmas party that year, and I met you guys all, and I just remember you being super cool, and we laughed a lot. Like, we just hit it off right away, just laughing and talking about stuff. And I didn't know anything about anything. And I was like, "Yeah, man, I'm going to like a million different youth groups. Anywhere my friends go, I go." And you looked at me, and it was prophetic. And you said to me, "That's cool and all. Oh yeah, I told you, oh yeah, I teach a Bible study over in this park because these kids have been getting saved." And you go, "Yeah, that's cool and all. But Peyton, I think you're heading into a time where you need to be a student and not a teacher." And there's just times people say something. It was like, like I was arrogant enough to think as a brand new believer, I was going to teach all these kids. And I went, oh, huh. And I couldn't argue with it. It was the Holy Spirit. And I went, okay. And I started coming along and I said, hey, I got all these you want me to bring them too? And Dan goes, sure. Yeah, bring them. Great. And that was kind of the start of our relationship together. And some of these crazy whacked out kids started coming in the beginning. They weren't so bad. It was later, right? When the Lord started popping off. So yes. Dan, the question I want to ask, that's how you and I met. And of course, I'll talk a little bit more about our relationship, but what are your memories of those days, man? Tell us what happened over the next couple years. Cause I mean, you were a youth pastor minding your own business, and then boom, it all went. If I were in Britain, I'd say it all went Pete Tong, and everybody would know what that meant. You tell us what it means.
Well, of course, it's a very long story, and I'll try to keep it short. But the call to understand Jesus Christ in a world that was rejecting him left and right was one that I found interesting and scary at the same time, as you know. The fact that a message that I had heard that had changed my life and caused the direction of my life to change in such a radical way that I was losing friends and family was distancing themselves from me. I knew there had to be something here. On the outward, I'm sure people looked at me and thought that I was losing my mind, but I had a peace in my heart, and this was what gravitated me towards wanting to get the message out to the most hungriest group of people there was. And that was interesting because it happened simply with the pastor approaching me and saying, I'd like to start a youth group. And we only had one kid who was going to the church at that time. And so it began that way. And you came in shortly after that, Peyton. And that's when it really started to take off, because I didn't have the training of a youth pastor through any seminary. Just what I was experiencing by sharing the gospel personally myself. And that, to me, I think is what I saw in you, is that you weren't looking for anything that was going to, in a sense, set you apart as a teacher in the church, but you saw yourself as someone who was a preacher of the word in a world that needed to be saved. And I think that the difference a lot of times is that we look at the church as the end all, when actually it should be the sending portion of our lives, that we go out into a world, we preach the gospel, the church is there to support us and to help us. We come back, get refreshed, we move back out again. We meet on Sundays, we get the gospel out on Monday. And I think that that's what I saw in you at a young age, is that you weren't churchy, if I can use that word. You were a kid that was in love with Jesus, and I think that that's what happened. So I was excited to see that, knowing that that would be some kind of a change at some point, but not ever realizing that I would be sitting here today talking to you of years and years of a faithful God who is still telling me to this day, get the word out, Dan.
That's awesome. And you're a pastor now up in Oregon.
Yes.
And it was amazing because watching you back then, like that was true of you as well. Everything you just said. And I always tell people the mission in me came from you. That was your mission. And I can remember we were this little church plant. I think when I got there couldn't have been more than 50 people in it, maybe less.
Yeah.
And it grew. I mean, it exploded. But I can remember a time where the youth group was like, I don't remember how big it got, but it was twice the size of the congregation,
yes.
Even as the church was growing. And it was almost kind of like, at times people make comments like, is the tail wagging the dog, man? This thing is just exploded, and miraculous conversions. Just we saw, like, I saw exorcisms, because of the kind of people we were dealing with. I remember the first exorcism was in our youth group, and I mean, somebody had goo flying out of their face, and we saw healings. I mean, there were these crazy things popping off. That youth group was intense, and it prepped me for everything. Those nights at Murray Park were scary, and to this day,
they were.
Pete's been with me in Refuge Long Beach. I could not have done this stuff that I did there, or been a part of. I say I did. I didn't do anything, but I mean, I couldn't. I would not have had the faith if that preparation. I probably would not have had the faith to be a missionary overseas in a place like Wales if God had not shown that He really was the God of the New Testament. And that's kind of where reaching the unreached. That's why I say it's got your fingerprints all over it. But we're here really today to talk about your book. Book here, very attractive book, I must say, by Daniel M. Berg, it says, but only his mom calls him Daniel. We've already established that on this call. But Dan wrote a book, and it is a phenomenal book. Dan is a very good writer. He is one of the best preachers that I've ever heard. His discipleship classes that he used to run on Saturday nights are still some of my favorite times ever at church. They were discussion based. So again, his fingerprints are on me there. But this book, Dan, this is kind of the book when everything was going well, and when everything, seemed to be like the world was your oyster. I mean, things were just happening. You were put on staff as an assistant pastor, and in a growing church, a mega church, and that you were, instrumental in helping to grow and to build. At that moment, like the cover of the book shows, shattered glass. Your life shattered. I was just wondering if you could walk us through and tell us some of the story, because this book is one of the most powerful books I've ever read. And that's not because you're my mentor. It was I can't put this book down.
Are you going to tell us what the title of it is?
Did I not say Hard Faith?
Okay. I'm
Hard Faith, Pete. Hard Faith.
Thank you.
There, you happy?
I am. Available wherever paperbacks are sold.
Sorry, Dan. This is a very serious podcast. Back to what I was saying, Dan. Back to you, Dan.
Yes, sir. Yes. Well, I will do my best to tell you a story that, as Peyton said, it was as though I had the Midas touch, being looked at that way. And I was working at the time repairing furniture. I was also making pizzas. I don't know if Peyton remembers that, but I was also making pizzas and delivering them, and then working with the youth as well. So it was a busy time. Things were happening. Just we would pack out this rec center with bands and kids coming to know Christ, and my wife was beginning to get tired. We had 2 small children at the time. And I noticed that at times she would kind of get a little frustrated. And my wife is a very sweet lady, gentle lady. And at times I would see her get upset in ways I'd never seen her before. But I was out saving the world. And so I remember I came home one night. Our children had both, my daughter was born with a flat voice box. And so she had to be monitored through the night. We had taken her in, and the doctor said that they were considering putting a trach in her, but if we just monitored her, maybe she would be okay. And then my son began to have seizures. So she was tired out to say the least by taking care of two children that had a lot of needs. And I was out preaching and doing what I was doing. One night she came in and said she couldn't sleep because I would just come home and crash on the sofa at night. And I said, okay, honey, we'll just go try to get some sleep. And this happened for 7 nights in a row without her getting any sleep. And on the 7th night, she came in and fell on the floor and said she was going to hell. I was shocked, but I knew something was really, really wrong here for my wife to say something like that. So I contacted a friend of ours, and she came over and she said, need to put her in the hospital immediately, Dan. And if you don't, I will. Because she knew that I was weighing things out at that moment. Was I ready to admit to this or not? And so I put her in a mental hospital, and that was a tough night. She hung on to me and begged me not to leave her there. I came home to a house with 2 small children that wanted their mommy. And I found myself asking a lot of questions that night. The rest of it is a story of an amazing God in a very difficult place. And so the reason why I wrote the book is because everybody's got a story. I didn't think my story was any different, but it was enough for me to write a book to let other people know, if they find themselves in a place like this, that there is a God who goes to such depths, such darkness, to show a love and a compassion and a mercy that we can't translate until we've allowed him into the deepest part of that hurt. And when he comes into the deepest part of that hurt, a translation comes, and you understand when Paul said a fellowship of suffering. There's a language there. There are people there. There are experiences that can't be explained. And the book is to just maybe hope that when you find yourself in that place, that you're going to come out with some hard faith.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting because I had to look up the review that I wrote for this, and I would tell planners to grab this book because this actually, Pete, was in our book reviews for Jump School that we would offer to planners. This is
wait. You said Jump School? I have no idea which Jump School you're talking
Pete,
about.
Did you know I'm writing a textbook?
It's called Jump School, isn't it?
I almost texted you last night. Hey, I got a title. But when we included this in our training for planners, we had books that we would ask them to get and read, and this book was in there because what you started off with. Hey, I was busy out saving the world at a time where the allure of megachurch ministry was so hard. And I mean, to be honest, I didn't see a great imbalance going on the outside, but I remember when this started happening and Doris started struggling. And trust me, as a dad who has a special needs daughter who for years stopped breathing in the middle of the night, I remember those times. I remember you telling me, Gabe stopped breathing last night. I had to hold him in the bathtub under the running water. I remember all of that. And then years later to find myself in that same scenario, I know how draining it is as a parent and how just it takes everything out of you. Like you walk around sometimes, you don't know why you're so tired, and it's this exhaustion that people can't you can't communicate. You don't even know. Like, there's no guidebook with this. People, you retroactively figure it out later. But I wrote in this review, having witnessed the majority of Dan's testimony as a third party, I was amazed to read the honest portrayal of a man who held to his integrity like Job and lived what he preached. To most of us on the outside, it appeared to us as it must have looked to Job's friends, but somehow God was punishing him. I'm sorry to add that most of us found ourselves miserable comforters as well. Having read this book by one of the heroes of my young life, he stands even higher in my esteem now. God was teaching him more during that time that he wanted to know. The lesson shared, though, with these short number of pages is a condensed version of much of what he preached, distilled with tears through the filter of grief. Charles Spurgeon once wrote, David was like a rose. If you crushed him, he gave off a sweeter fragrance. He was also like an olive. When you crushed it, the more of the Holy Spirit flowed out of him. This book goes against the grain of most of the feel-good preaching we hear so often, pulpiteers pandering positivity. Dan Doris and the family learned hard faith firsthand. In the pulpit, Dan was a master communicator, and his writing proves to be just as rich in illustration. But Dan's book calls a believer to learn life lessons from God firsthand, because in some cases, we may find he is all we have. And that definitely, reading the book was kind of, I mean, it was 11 years, right? Like, in a time where people didn't know how to deal with something. Like, you know, I was a psychiatric nurse. Doris, it's so funny because God has done such a miracle in her life that I can normally tell. I can't even see any trace of it now in Doris. Like, it is literally a miracle that God has done in that woman's life. But you know what's really interesting is it wasn't a quick fix for you. And you wrote this at the end of a marathon journey of dealing with this. It wasn't just a flash in the pan. It was a long haul. Tell us a little bit more about that and where the first breakthrough happened for you.
I would say for me to understand exactly what I was up against happened when Doris was in a hospital there in Southern California. And she was telling me that if I could find out these answers that she had, that she would know that God loved her. And so she had me find out if the police department was wanting to arrest her. And so I knew that my sweet wife was not wanted by the police, but I thought if I went down to the Costa Mesa Police Department, they could write up a little thing and I could bring it back to her.
Which, by the way, Doris is the sweetest lady on the planet. Like,
she is.
Yeah.
And so that day, Barney Fife happened to be working at the counter. And he began 100 questions of why he couldn't write this up. And I told him, I said, could you just please just write on a piece of paper, you are not being wanted by the police. And he told me that he couldn't. And so I gave him a little card and I said, just write not wanted on the back. And so he did. I got that out of him. And so I left there, came back and told her, look, it's a police card and it says not wanted on the back. And she says, well, that's not good. It's funny, having mental illness, you're attuned in some areas to know exactly what you want. And she did. So the next thing she told me, she said, if you can go and talk to Pastor Chuck Smith, and if he says that I'm going to heaven, I will believe you, but you need to have him call me. Now, Pastor Chuck Smith, as you guys know, had a church that was humongous back then. And then he didn't know me from anyone. And so I got up really early in the morning thinking that maybe I could get there when he drove up in his car and that I could get him to call my wife. And So I got there, and Romaine showed up first. And Pastor Romaine took me into the office and told me that he would call her. And he did. And then when he got off the phone, he says, she's not the one that's got the problem. You're the one that's got the problem. And he began to lay into me. I was pretty tired and upset at that point. I said, I don't need to hear this. And I walked out. I think that him and I began a relationship at that point because I stood up to him. And I don't know, at some point, maybe he respected me standing up to him, but I was so tired. I really wasn't there to listen to him tell me things I already knew about myself and that I had failed. Those things that I had to deal with, but taking care of two small children, a wife in a mental hospital, you had to, have those times when if you're going to speak truth to me, I better be ready to hear it because of all the stuff that's going on. So over a period of time, he realized that that she wasn't getting the help and that she wasn't getting better. So I came into him one time and asking if he had anybody else that she could talk with, and it was an interesting moment because the church at that time was not wanting to talk about mental illness. It was taboo. I had taken her to several churches. They had told me that she was demon possessed. I had others tell me that she wasn't born again. Nothing but rejection from one church after another. And he pulls this card out. And it was almost like he looked to the right and to the left. I love the man. I know he's passed on. But he hands me this card and he says, this is the card we give to people whom we can't help. And I went, wow. I felt like Willy Wonka and got the golden chocolate bar, and I just, wow. So I came back and I called her and she brought us in and she asked Doris to come in first. And so she talked with Doris and then called me in, and I came in and sat in the office, and I had sat in many of these offices over the time. I think we're probably at the 4-year mark at this point of this trial. She asked Doris, where are you going? And Doris said, I'm going to hell. She turned to me and she says, Dan, where is Doris going? And I said, she's going to heaven. She turns back to Doris again and says, Doris, where are you going? And Doris knew I hated to hear this. And she says, I'm going to hell. She turns to me and she says, Dan, where is Doris going? At this point, I am very upset. And I said to her, she's going to heaven. Like I was about ready to walk out of that counseling appointment thinking, what a colossal waste of time this is. She turns back to Doris and she says, Doris, where are you going? And Doris, looking to the ground, knowing that I did not want to hear it, said again, I'm going to hell. Something happened at that point. I don't know exactly what it was, but it's like, when you hear from the Lord, everything goes quiet in your mind and your mind focuses on one thing. And that's what took place. I was so angry and upset that my mind calmed down so quickly. Within a millisecond, my mind just went quiet. And for once through this whole thing, was I able to really hear my wife. The scripture tells us that, we're to work to understand our wives, lest our prayers be hindered. And that is one thing I was not trying to do, was to understand my wife. I was trying to tell her, this is what you should do. This is what you should believe, but never taking the time to understand her. And I had this overwhelming sense come over me that this is exactly where she thought she was going. And I turned to the counselor and I said, she's going to hell. And the counselor looked at me and she says, now you know where you need to go. And that was mind blowing. I remember taking Doris back to the hospital and driving home that night and beginning to think about all that came from that statement. But the way my mind works, I thought, this is the first time I've paid somebody $70 an hour to tell me to go to hell. But it was $70 that was worth it, because at that point I knew to truly understand her. And I know maybe some of your listeners may not understand this, Peyton, but I had to get transformed in order to understand my wife. At that time, I had women calling me and wanting to date me. Some were offering more. And I knew that those temptations were coming hard and fast. I knew that God was not telling me what other people were telling me. I had friends and family telling me to leave her, to get on with my life. But God was not telling me that. And so transformation had to take place in order for me to be able to adapt to the new life I would be living, a life of understanding my wife's hell. And so I stopped brushing my teeth. I stopped shaving as much. I stopped bathing as much. In a sense, I began to understand her through that. I know that sounds a little bizarre, but that was the world that God was calling me to be in. And I had to be able to love her in that world. It just reminded me of Philippians chapter 2. He humbled himself and came as a man. And he was asking me to love my wife in a very, very dark place. That was the first big change.
It's interesting because during that time, I mean, your book is brutally honest. And, I mean, you mentioned being on a job and driving down Pacific Coast Highway and even thinking, man, I know I got kids to take care of, but what if I just jerk this wheel to the left, right now, or even to the right, it was a tough time. And I think one of the things that the book really brings out is not only did you go through something, you went from being this preacher that God had really used, I mean, very powerfully, to all of a sudden having to live these things. And not that you weren't living it before, brother, because I knew you then. Wasn't like you were on some, walk through Disneyland prior to that. But like kind of like how I mentioned, like Job's comforters, like nobody knew how to even interpret what you're going through. I mean, I think we live in a different time right now where it's still not great regarding mental illness. But back then it was like, you were like Lewis and Clark, man. There was nobody had been over those mountains yet and turned around and told everybody, hey, here's a roadmap, here's the routes you need to take. And so when this book came out, to me, this was an important book simply because you had navigated it. But that word faith, there was always kind of this thread of faith all the way throughout. And now I can tell you this. For those of you that don't know Dan, we're asking him to kind of relive some very painful things. And yet, Dan is the guy that when I call him, we spend the majority of the call laughing, right? And cracking jokes. Dan is the mentor who taught me that you can have the Holy Spirit just ripping through you, that when you are weak, He is strong. And that is what Dan taught me more than any other lesson was, like I said, Dan would make fun of himself and go, look, hey, I'm this old guy, like he was in his 30s. We were trying to figure out how old he was, but he would put on this grandpa voice. And grandpa would make appearances and cameos in his sermons. But Dan he never took himself seriously, but he took God very seriously. And so we knew what it was to experience the anointing of the Holy Spirit and immediately go from watching all these kids radically transform, giving their hearts to Christ. Like I said, cops busting punkers, and skinheads, and people getting set free from demonic possession, like radical. Like I don't even know how to explain it if you weren't there. But to go immediately from that, to Dan and me to decompress after these nights of hardcore ministry, watching Yo MTV raps and laughing till we cried, heckling rap videos. And there was this sense of Dan just always knew how to laugh, and he still does. Like that's the great thing. And I think that was the biggest takeaway. But Dan, what kind of part did laughter play in God's healing process for you guys as a family? Because he mentioned that in the book.
Yeah. Humility is an untapped comedic resource. True humility. When you really take a seriously look at yourself and realize the place you're in, you have choices to make. You can look at it and see it as, oh my gosh, it's all over with, or there's got to be fun somewhere in this. And it is amazing. My daughter is probably, and my son, I love them both dearly, but they became a comedy team during this time. They would get things going and I would be laughing. I remember one time driving in the car and they did this little thing and they had me laughing so hard my stomach was aching and I couldn't see straight. And they learned laughter. They learned jokes. They learned humor. They learned not to take themselves seriously because it was the only thing that we had. And I remember one day, when Doris began to laugh and just sitting there and crying because of her laughter. I saw it, and she even says to this day that it had such an impact on her healing is to watch her children and her husband laugh. And a friend of mine, I asked him, to come over for dinner, and I couldn't get him quite the directions of the trailer park we were living in. And he said, so I got out of my car and I began to walk around thinking that maybe I would just yell your name and you would come out of your trailer or whatever. He says, but I heard this trailer with a bunch of people laughing. And he says, that's got to be where they live. Sure enough, it was. And Doris was a part of that laughter. There were things that happened that you develop a strange sense of humor in mental hospitals.
Yep.
And, and realizing that the people in the hospitals are probably more well off than the people that are not in the hospitals because they're dealing with the realities and truths of life. And unfortunately for many, it drew them to places where they had to be hospitalized. But many of them, to being able to be laughter to them was such a joy. And I as a child, I had a difficult childhood, as most kids coming up these days do. And we learned humor at a very young age. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. It does. And I think that, it's interesting. Like you mentioned that sense of humor. Pete and I have that. Pete's dad was a minister and, he saw some of the sides of life, but for me as a firefighter, as an RN, dealing with death at a very young age. And, eventually, you mentioned the home we grew up in, the home I grew up in wasn't always pretty. And at the end of the day, I was a psych nurse, and I agree with that 100%. 100% spot on. And the first thing that ever stuck out to me about working in the psychiatric hospital, this is the thing, is movies have not done credit. Over 50% of the population has been diagnosed with some type of anxiety or depressive disorder. That is crazy, right? 10% of the population has schizophrenia of some type. Could just be paranoia, could be mild, whatever. So my view when I got out of the work in the psychiatric hospital, the first thing that hit me was there are two major takeaways. One was everybody in there was just like me. They weren't weirdos. They weren't like what you see on Hollywood. They were normal people you work with, you live next to, that have ended up at a place where they need help. They can't cope with it by themselves anymore. And I'll never forget being in the psychiatric hospital. And I was normally on the lockdown unit. There was a high functioning unit where people weren't a danger to themselves, but I was on the extremely violent lockdown. But if I went over to the higher functioning, I had not long left being on staff at a megachurch. Every time I went to that wing, someone would say, "Pastor Peyton," and they'd start crying, like, "What are you doing here?" And I was praying that a pastor would. And it was like, really, like, in our church, we never, like, even then, because this is the 90s still, and I was like, we're not equipped as the church to deal with this. We don't even talk about it. But yes, definitely developing that sense of humor is a survival skill. And I think that even Spurgeon, you kind of taught me about Spurgeon and humor. And Lloyd Jones, towards the end of his life, who abhorred the use of humor in the pulpit and illustration for that matter, at the end of his life said, "Yeah, I was wrong." People don't usually tell you that part, but that's what he said. So Dan, I want to thank you. The book is Hard Faith. If you want to get a copy of this book, definitely let us know. I don't know if it's still available for sale. Is it, Dan? Is it the kind of thing where
it's on
Amazon? Still on Amazon? I looked for it and I couldn't find it. Okay, well, go to Amazon, guys. Honestly,
go to Amazon and type in Hard Faith Daniel M. Berg. There you go.
I did. My Amazon's stupid. All right. Well, guys, definitely check it out. My guest has been Dan Berg. Do not call him Daniel M. Berg. That's his writing name, but he's Dan to me and you. And thanks so much for coming on. I love you to bits. I love Doris to bits. And want to thank you for opening up and sharing this very vulnerable part of your life. But I know it's part of who you are. It's part of what you do. So want to thank you for that. And Pete,
are you seriously going to transition after this talk?
Pete, while you're doing all that laughter and that laughing, and I can't do it. I can't. Dan, every time we do a podcast, we transition seamlessly. If we're a guy who's talking about doing this, and we say, while you're doing all that, you don't have time. I can't do it. So,
hey, while you're having to deal with trauma in your family,
you can't do it. You can't do it.
You really can't.
There is no okay. Hey, Pete, I want to tell you about Simplified Church. It's a bookkeeping service that Dan, this is why we have no sponsors.
We ruin their commercials.
We ruin it. And they know that, and they love us about it because they know our audience is church planners. So church planners, if you have not gotten Simplified Church yet, you're just stupid. How's that?
That's a horrible commercial.
Okay, all right. See, it threw me off my game because we couldn't transition. Hey, guys, Simplify Church, this will be the best ad we've ever done for them. Simplify Church. Guys, you don't have time to do all your bookkeeping, your IRS compliance, your end-of-year tax giving, donor receipts. Wait, what? You didn't know you had to do those? Yeah, you did. And the deadline was January 31st. So you need to get simplifychurch.com. They are a team of professionals that will help you do all your bookkeeping and IRS compliance. They even have a giving portal now. What? If you haven't set that up, they said, Pete, I'm not even letting you join in. Okay. So, you want to add anything to that? Because I was on a roll.
Simplifychurch.com.
Boom, right there. Well, guys, hey, this has been Peyton Jones and Pete Mitchell and Dan Berg And we've been reminding you today, if you want to reach the ones nobody is reaching, you need to go where nobody's going and do what nobody's doing.
Thanks for joining us for another weekly episode of the Church Planter Podcast with Pete Mitchell and Peyton Jones. We'd love to hear your comments on this episode of the Church Planter Podcast. Visit us online and let us know what you thought at churchplanterpodcast.com. If you subscribe to us via iTunes and have enjoyed the podcast, leave us a positive review. The more positive reviews we receive in iTunes, the more iTunes will promote us to other church planners who would benefit from this show. This podcast is brought to you by the Church Planter Magazine, which is available in the iTunes newsstand or online via churchplantermagazine.com.